Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us at today's Link event, Decoding the Riddle, Mystery, and Enigma of Russia and the Emerging New World Order. Today's panel discussion will be followed by a Q&A session with our audience. If you are new to the Link program, welcome. Link is the Young Professionals program at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy that I, Shana Katz, and my colleague Anna Brown coordinate. Anna is going to tell you a little bit more about the Link program right now.
Link is sorry, that was my fault. Okay, sorry about that. Link is a networking and events initiative that brings together young professionals working in foreign policy from a variety of vantage points. Link, like everything in DC, is an acronym standing for Learn, Inform, Network, and Know. We host a variety of events throughout the year aimed at deepening our understanding of key topics in foreign affairs and the different career paths available to young professionals interested in foreign policy. The Washington Institute for Near East Policy, of which Link is a part, is a nonprofit research institute dedicated to putting forward research and nonpartisan, actionable policy advice to advance American interests and values in the Middle East.
And we have an outstanding panel with us this afternoon, and it is our pleasure to now introduce the members of our distinguished panel. Both panelists are former ambassadors and veterans of 5 administrations. Joining us today is the Institute's William Davidson Distinguished Fellow, Dennis Ross, former special assistant to the President and former White House National Security Council Senior Director for the Central Region, and former Undersecretary for the State of Global Affairs, Paula Dobriansky, who currently is Senior Fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center and Vice Chair of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council.
This discussion will be moderated by Josh Rogan, an award-winning columnist for the Washington Post and political analyst with CNN. And with that, we're going to hand the floor over to Josh and get the event started.
Thank you so much. Is this on? Can you guys hear me?
We do.
Okay.
Seems like it.
Thank you so much for coming out here. So nice to see you all in person. Been a while since we've had these kinds of events, and I on the elevator up here, we were talking about what we did earlier today. Earlier today, I attended the funeral of former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, and what was so clear from all of the testimonials was not just what a great patriot and a great public servant she was, but how she spent so much time mentoring young professionals and really building a generation of young professionals following her footsteps. And to my pleasant surprise, Paula, you said that she was a mentor of yours. So I thought, why not start with that story before we get into all the heavy Ukraine, Russia, world order stuff? And then perhaps, Ambassador Ross, you could tell us a story of maybe one of your first mentors. And maybe I'll go too. But Paula, why don't you tell us about you and Madeleine Albright?
All right. Well, it is working great. Well, first, thank you for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be here this evening. And thank you, Josh. And, my career didn't exactly begin at the National Security Council, but in some ways it did. And that's where she came into play. I was getting my graduate degree from Harvard University, my master's and PhD. And one of my doctoral thesis professors, I had 2, I had Adam Olam and Samuel Huntington. And Samuel Huntington was very close to Zbigniew Brzezinski. So interestingly enough, how this started and how I met Madeleine Albright was because Zbigniew Brzezinski was a strong believer in having an internship program and bringing young professionals into the NSC as interns. So I was twice an intern there during the Carter administration. The second time I really moved from being an intern into a full position there. But it was on that occasion when I met Madeleine Albright. And interestingly enough, a tidbit I don't think that a lot of people know is Albright actually, in that context on the NSC, she was the director of legislative affairs. That's actually how she began in working at the NSC and with Zbigniew Brzezinski. Well, that's the occasion we met, and we connected because of our keen interest and our backgrounds relevant to Eastern Europe. She being from the Czech Republic, and my background of being of Ukrainian descent, and also as catalyzed by Brzezinski. So to cut to it, we kept in touch for many years, and she always insisted that I check in with her, tell me where you are, what I could do to help you to further. And I'll just give one vignette and also maybe a note of inspiration to all of you. So I felt it was a real privilege. I was able to translate that internship program into a full position. It was then in the Reagan administration, and I was 24 years old. And at 24, on the full NSC staff, there was a small staff at the time, but at 24, she called me up and she said, I'm teaching over at Georgetown University. I want you to come and speak to my class. Let's hear what are the Reagan administration policies towards Central and Eastern Europe. So it was just fantastic. We've kept really in touch for a lifetime. She was an incredible mentor, an incredible leader, a real inspiration, and someone who I really adored and was very inspired by. So thank you for that question.
Excellent. Thank you. Ambassador Ross, do you have a mentor story you'd love to share?
I do, but it's hard not to talk about Madeline.
Oh, please do. Yeah.
Madeline and I was a political appointee for 2 Republican presidents and 2 Democratic presidents. Well, it turns out in the case of George H.W. Bush, when he was running against Michael Dukakis, I was running the foreign policy part of the campaign for Bush. And guess who was running the foreign policy part of the campaign for Dukakis? Madeline. So we actually debated several times.
Wow.
But we became good friends. Now, when she became the Secretary of State and I was our negotiator in the Middle East, the first thing she said when I walked in, says, "Boy, I'm glad you're staying. And do you remember when we debated?" I said, "Yeah, I do." She says, "I'm now your boss." I said, I figured that, yeah. I tell the story because she was, in a lot of ways, she was not tall in stature, but she was amazing in terms of the shadow she cast. And she was the conscience of, I think, of a lot of us. But I still recall one thing she said when she was secretary, that no other secretary that I worked for or president ever raised the same way. She is the only one who would constantly, I don't think this will surprise you, Paula, she is the only one who would say, after we've been working on an issue for a while, she would say, "Look, let's take a look at our assumptions again. Is reality validating those assumptions or not?" And I say it because assumptions are almost always implicit. Oftentimes in policy making, people are not even aware of the assumptions that are guiding them. Madeline, maybe because she was an academic by training, she was the only one in that position who ever used to basically say, all right, let's take a step back and ask ourselves, are these assumptions in fact being validated or not? So yes, I knew her for a long time. I really treasured the relationship. In terms of mentors, I would say probably the person who had the greatest effect on me was Jim Baker. He is not someone who thinks conceptually, and yet he was the best negotiator I was ever around. And I would say I learned everything I needed to know about negotiations from watching him. Even though I'm an academic by training, I read all the literature on negotiations, and in one of my books, I also have come up with 12 rules for negotiations and 11 for mediation. And I would say these are the kind of rules that would appeal to Baker. They're not drawn from the literature, but they're drawn from a practitioner's guide. And he was a practitioner par excellence.
Excellent.
But by the way, may I just 2 more fast? And
We gotta keep this
I
going.
know we do. I know
We're
we do.
having a
This
good
is going to be
time,
very
so-
fast. It's going to be fast.
All
I
right.
know.
That's
I've heard
we
that.
came to have a good time. I don't know about you.
All right.
We
I got
know
nothing
Josh,
to
and Josh cracks the whip. So, okay. So, but 2 fast ones. One, when I was undersecretary, she approached me because she conceived what is known as the community of democracies. And that was part of my portfolio as undersecretary in the George W. Bush administration. She was very concerned about whether or not the administration would sustain that approach. And to cut to it, we also very much bonded over that, which was wonderful. And last one, this is for the young ladies in this audience, especially. She would speak to a lot of different women's groups. And it was one of the most funny things that I ever heard her say. And forgive me, gentlemen in this audience, but she would say this boldly, and sometimes she would even say it in front of gentlemen. So she said, one of the things that when I look back on my career that I really learned, She goes, I've been in these interagency meetings and I'm the only woman sitting there. But then there's like a couple of actually a few other women. And so I go ahead and I make a suggestion. And then nobody responds. Nobody says anything. And then lo and behold, maybe 5 minutes pass. And then there's some other guy and he says this thing that I said. And then there's another guy and he pats him on the back. And she said, that just infuriated me. And she said, women, back one another up. Don't let the men have the train of conversation. So forgive me. I had to say that because I've heard her. That's one she mentioned so many times. And she said, I became a fighter in these interagency meetings and you got to back one another up.
She said you have to interrupt.
That's right.
You have to interrupt. And then when you interrupt, you have to know what you're going to say and have your facts straight and your thoughts clear. I was at the funeral this morning. That's why I had that at my fingertips. Thank you for that addition. Very, very quickly, I'll tell you the story of my first mentor. I was a sophomore at the George Washington University in 19, and I walked into the Brookings Institution into the 6th floor with no appointment, and I walked into the office of E.J. Dionne, who was a writer who I admired, and I said, my name is Josh Rogan. I live 3 blocks away. I work for free. I can be here Mondays and Wednesdays and Fridays from 9 to 12. And he thought about it for a second. He said, that's your desk. And that was my first internship. I was a Brookings intern. And, the lesson that he taught me, the first thing E.J. Dionne said is, he said, there's 2 ways to get ahead in Washington, by being a jerk or by being kind. He said, always be kind. And that can get you ahead just as well as being a jerk, but it's better. And now I write on the same page as him at the Washington Post. And, so all things. And I stole from Madeleine Albright her brooch thing. That's my Madeleine Albright story. I wear pins because Madeleine Albright inspired me. This is my U.S.-Tibet friendship flag pin.
I wore my pin.
Ukraine.
Sorry, I'm left out.
All right. You didn't get the memo. On to the official program. Let's start with assumptions. I don't know why I brought this. I was going to follow this anyway. Assumptions. Seems like a lot of assumptions are getting re-examined after the attack on Ukraine. All of a sudden, we're starting to think about what's risk, what's deterrence, what good is engagement? Can we have change through trade, as the Germans would argue? A lot of those assumptions are really up for grabs after the attack. But why weren't they called into question before the attack? How did we get here? That's what I want to. Let me start with you, Beth.
One of the reasons it was so important for Madeleine to actually say, let's be explicit and recognize what our assumptions are, as I was saying before, too often policies are sort of created and they endure by habit. So you never basically ask basic questions about, well, why do we have these positions that we do? I think if you take a step back, there's a lot of different kinds of assumptions, but I want to just flag one right now that we haven't generally talked about. Isn't it interesting that we basically bought the same assumption about what was going to happen in Ukraine that Putin did? We offered Zelensky, we offered to evacuate him. Why? Because we thought the Russians were going to actually decapitate with shock and awe. This government was going to be gone. They'd be in there. They'd take over Ukraine. That was an assumption.
That Putin would win.
Yeah, but not just win, but very quickly. And, in a sense, we were operating on a premise about great Russian military power. Where, in fact, had they demonstrated it? Nowhere where they actually faced any real resistance. But we basically operated on that premise. What if we had been operating on a different premise? What if, in fact, we had understood the relative hollowness of that military on the one hand, the resolve of the Ukrainians on the other? We would have been providing what we're providing now to them. We would have been providing to them much earlier. So there was an assumption that was wrongheaded. And it's a reminder.
By both administrations, both sides.
Yeah, this wasn't unique to
bipartisan failures.
Yeah. By the way, assumptions can be shared.
Right.
Maybe there aren't too many that are, but they can be shared in a way, and that this was clearly one.
So that's one big assumption, that Ukraine couldn't win. The other big assumption that I think we really got wrong was that Putin could be deterred, right? That there was something that we could have, or was that a wrong assumption? Or maybe this one is for you, Paula.
Well-
What happened with our deterrence? We had this beautiful deterrence story in our mind. It didn't work.
Well, there's a difference of opinion over that. So let me take it from two angles. First, one, definition of deterrence would mean you take action. You take action, be it military, be it strong economic action, to try to deter an invasion from taking place. I did sign a letter last year. It was last year. It was signed by Republicans, Democrats, Independents, organized by the Atlantic Council, which said very strongly to the administration, you need to take military or economic action now to try to deter Putin from invading. So there was a difference of opinion because
You're saying deterrence wasn't strong enough.
because, and this is what I'm about to say, because the counter was by the administration, the approach taken was, we will state what we are going to do, but we're not going to do it yet. Because if we do it, that will escalate things, and then sure as heck, it will happen. So I think there was a wrong assumption there of just by stating what you do or will do, that would deter the Russians. But forgive me for adding this in historically, and I've thought really hard on this. You know, Putin made his first statement about the tragedy of losing the Soviet Union in 2005. And then it was the Munich Security Conference when he made his famous speech, Western values, not our values, no to NATO enlargement, America can't be unipolar, and significantly, hey, if Russian citizens are in danger, we have a right to go in and save them. So then we saw all that happened in between, Grozny, Georgia, Ossetia there, the illegal annexation of Crimea, the occupation of the Donbass region, Syria, et cetera, et cetera. So the question would be, would he have been deterred even if we took those actions? And
Would
I've
he have
asked
been
myself,
deterred if
right,
we had
if
taken
we even took
What do you think?
imposed sanctions? Well, you want to know, I've thought about that. And the tragedy is, why I think that he did invade is because also he felt he could do it and get away with it. I think that Afghanistan did, in my own personal view, I think Afghanistan had an imprimatur on a sign of weakness of the United States, a lack of credibility, pulling out. I think that combined with Nord Stream 2, combined in the mix, and thirdly, the tensions that exist between the United States and Europe. I think that Putin's assumption was that the transatlantic relationship was going to be so fragmented that, again, it was going to be a weak moment and he could get in and he can fulfill his
So
operation.
wrong assumptions on his side, clearly.
Correct.
Deal with them. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I want to pick up on this
Sure.
because there are two sides to his miscalculations. One, he drank his own Kool-Aid. Okay, he had mythologies about Ukraine. He had mythologies about himself and Russia. That was entirely a function of his misunderstanding. You could call that irrationality. Where he was not being irrational was believing that, in fact, we wouldn't do anything or we would do very little, precisely because of what Paul was saying. Look at the pattern of behavior. It goes back to Georgia. Each of these moves he makes, Georgia draws no real response. Crimea, minimal response. Eastern Ukraine, almost no response. Goes into Syria. And the attitude is, it's a quagmire, let him sink in it. And when he first goes in, much like when he goes into, think about when he goes into Crimea, he goes in with little green men. He's very uneasy about what the response might be. He wants to create deniability. When he sees there's no, same thing in Syria. When he initially goes into Syria, done surreptitiously. Then when he sees there's no pushback, okay. So as time goes by, each of these non-responses or minimal responses convinces him there isn't a price to be paid. And Afghanistan, not in my mind, I guess where we may or may not agree, you can debate the issue of whether we should have gotten out of Afghanistan. You can't debate how we did it. And the way we did it sends him this further message that, look, we're so anxious to get out of places, we're so determined to retrench that, we're not going to react because he will impose something very quickly and then we'll all simply adjust to it. That wasn't irrational on his part.
It wasn't irrational, but it was wrong.
It was wrong.
It was a wrong assumption. But were our assumptions about his assumptions incorrect? Did we misassume his assumptions?
Well, I
His
think
misassumptions.
Paula put her finger on what I think was, for a while, we had self-deterred. Going back to Obama in terms of not being prepared to provide lethal assistance, there was a debate within the administration and those who favored it. He overruled. Why? Because he felt it was going to be provocative, because it was more important to Putin than it was to us. He would have escalation dominance. We self-deterred. Trump approves certain weapons and then, of course, doesn't allow them to be deployed. And then obviously he does something else where he withholds weaponry because he wants to gain political advantage. All right. Look, the more that we acted as if this was really important to Putin, the more we actually validated his assumption. So, yeah, do I think that had we adopted a different set of behaviors over time, we could have deterred him? Yes.
I would
I guess we'll never
would-
know.
I
But
would- I would-
would
I
have been
would-
worth a shot.
I would agree with that. I just want to say that I would agree, and I agree with what you've just said totally. May I add
Well,
one
I gotta-
other
we're-
element?
no,
Wait, no, I know you are, but it's important. We gotta say this.
We got
An assumption,
questions.
wait a
Okay.
second, it's an important, it's a
I
fast
never
one.
want to.
It's a 30 second.
But we
it's
have
a 30
answers. So
second,
Yes.
a 30
Go ahead.
second.
Go ahead.
No, we got to put this on the table. You know what the 30-second assumption that also I think all sides missed? Is that the Ukrainian leadership was going to be weak. I had to get that in there. Because of what you said before. And we haven't addressed that. Zelensky has performed heroically. Amazing. He turned down going out. And I mean, his communication skills have been phenomenal. Phenomenal.
Okay. Assumption number 3. I want to talk about the big assumption. The assumption that engaging and trading with authoritarian dictatorships would eventually cause them to economically and then politically liberalize, and that would solve all of our problems, right? I'm simplifying it to be sure. But anyway, it seems like that was the plan with Putin and China for the better part of my career and better part of your careers. Is that assumption now? Can we say that that was wrong? And if so, how did we get that so wrong? Did we not engage them correctly? Or did we engage them honestly and they just decided to go another way? Or what happened? How did with the project
I'm
of
curious to
engaging
what you say to this. I'm very
totalitarian dictatorships fail? More or less. I think it failed.
So let me start,
Yeah.
as someone trained as an academic, I'm going to start with a kind of an academic argument that actually goes back to Walt Rostow and the stages of development. Okay, there was a kind of sense of in comparative literature way back when we were students, there was this almost deterministic view of, because of what Rostow had written about the stages of development, that there was almost an inexorable move if you cross certain thresholds of development, that almost by definition it had to create a more open society. I wrote a doctoral dissertation on Soviet decision making, and I actually didn't buy that logic then, because I didn't see it operating there. Because they actually had an ideology of power. It wasn't an ideology, Marxism, Leninism, it was a slogan for them, but that wasn't actually what their ideology was. How do they keep themselves in power? That's what mattered more than anything else. So let's fast forward. It was, I think, when we allowed the Chinese to enter the World Trade Organization, and we bent the rules to allow them to do it, it was based on this premise that, this will force them to liberalize. Inevitably, it'll force them to liberalize. And the more they open up, the more that they'll have their own, their own citizens won't, and this also goes back to these stages of development, their own citizens will require more forms of expression. And even to be effective and to grow economically, they're going to have to create greater space for people to operate. And that will eventually have political implications. I think the short answer is no. If you have leaderships that are led by a determined view of what it takes for them to be successful in power, That's what is more important than anything else. And that's what you have to be able to read. Now, look, maybe if you didn't have Xi Jinping in power in China, who seems to have transformed what was a political system that seemed to be more reflected of Deng Xiaoping, maybe things would have been different. But, this was still a country that was still governed by a self-image, number one. Number two, it lent itself very much to how you cement power. And seems to me that that should have been a signal to us to be more cautious in terms of our expectations.
I have a very quick answer to give you back some time,
I
Josh.
doubt that. but-
And the quick answer is, I don't know how many in the audience remember the name Ambassador Jean Kirkpatrick, but immediately when he asked the question, what comes to my mind is her famous article entitled Dictatorships and Double Standards. And specifically, my answer would be no as well. And she documented and articulated in the context of human rights how you can deal with some authoritarian regimes and influence them potentially, but in terms of totalitarian, no way.
Interesting. Last assumption. The assumption, and it sort of feeds off your point, Ambassador Ross, about power really being the only thing that matters to these countries. We'd assume that if we built up this thing called the international liberal, small L liberal world order with multilateral institutions and civil society and international norms and international laws and the WTO and the UN Security Council and all of that jazz, that would rope all of these countries, including ours, into yielding some power for a common benefit to keep peace and stability. That was the basic play. That also seems not to have borne out, frankly. Doesn't seem like any of those organizations is functioning the way they were designed to, and some of them are, frankly, doing more harm than good. So even in America, there's not really bipartisan support for these multilateral mechanisms the way there once was, even in Jean Kirkpatrick's time. So is that assumption wrong, that we should build a international system of laws and norms to govern all of us? And are we just now back to like might makes right? So we just might as well just like take these guys on one by one?
Well, the answer is I hope not. Look, the idea of having certain basic norms where might doesn't make right, where bigger nations don't get to devour or absorb smaller nations, where making civilians your preferred target, these cannot be acceptable. There has to be a price that's paid. So there should be international norms. There should be some international institutions, but I think we have to approach the institutions also recognizing that hard power matters. And if you're not prepared to exercise hard power, if you think that it's always soft power, so long as hard power is going to be used by others, then it has to be something that backs your diplomacy. As someone who spent a lot of time negotiating, I can tell you, I always viewed diplomacy as being effective when there was a coercive element to it. Now, there's a lot of ways to exercise leverage, positive and negative. But the coercive side, which is negative, it has to be there. And when you remove that, unfortunately, any of your multilateral institutions aren't going to be effective. So yeah, we don't want these institutions to disappear. Even the UN, with a lot of its failings, there are also things that it does and functions that it performs that someone would have to perform. So I don't want to walk away from the institutions, but I want to be mindful about what they can do and what they can't do.
I think that international norms do matter. I think they're crucial, but I also think there has to be accountability. And also I'd use the word enforcement. And that's essentially, you used a softer term. But if you have these norms, they have to be, countries have to be accountable. They have to be called to task if they are undermining them. I think what we're witnessing in Ukraine brings to the forefront the fact that so many treaties and these international norms have been abrogated very frontally, just starting with the Budapest Memorandum, which, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in return for this protection of its territorial integrity and sovereignty. one of the flaws maybe of that memorandum was there wasn't a per se an enforcement mechanism, but nevertheless it was good faith. So I would say that from having been an undersecretary of global affairs, every issue that I dealt with, every single one was multinational, transnational, and we dealt with regional institutions, of course, the United Nations and all of its sub-institutions, among others. Why I raise it is because what's striking to me, moving slightly away from norms, but in terms of global impact, I think that there were many cases where we did have impact as a global community through the United Nations in ways where maybe we wouldn't have ordinarily. There have been some peacekeeping operations that have made a difference. I would pick out HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria as an example of an institution that was established in the UN that really had a difference, and those countries coalesced around it. But also, having said that, when you bring to the forefront topical issues into the Security Council, you witness absolute politicization, as well as the UN Human Rights Council, where you have some of the most egregious offenders there who are calling into judgment other countries. And I don't need to tell you that Israel, I think, is one of the most targeted countries in the United Nations, in terms of the number of resolutions which are attacking Israel. So here, norms do matter. And I think that this situation brings that to the forefront. B is transparency, accountability, and enforcement. And then also here, I think what's important is looking at those institutions, what has worked, and those areas where there has been a common good, but those areas where there is continued violations that we have witnessed. And then the question is, do you keep the members the same in these organizations, or do you change it? And the one last, I've also noticed there's been kind of a shift. This isn't so much on your question per se, but in terms of security arrangements. I am very struck by the debate about, well, we have NATO and it's a collective defense arrangement. But then you look at Asia. Asia doesn't have a security arrangement per se, but it has a lot of new institutions that are more free form, like the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. Australia has formed an alignment with Indonesia and India. And then there's the US, Japan, and Australia. Then now there's AUKUS. All of these are more facile. That's why I wanted to bring in the fold. They're not institutions like you're defining, but what strikes me, they have a target, a purpose that unites the countries where there's a mission and they're united through the mission, which might be more of the wave of the future. And that could also have an impact on the global order.
All right. Before we go, thank you very much. Before we go to questions, let me just see if I captured what we sort of reached here. The way we assumed the world would develop after the Cold War was wrong. The assumptions we made about our enemies were wrong. Their assumptions were wrong. The assumptions we made about the deterrence and risk were wrong. The assumptions we made about our system and multilateral organizations were wrong. My last question is, what now? Do we have the capacity as a government and as a industry and as a society to make the changes to react to the changing events? Is it really even possible in this world of divided politics and fragmented attention to coalesce around the resource-intensive effort of reforming this order in order to save it? Is that even realistic?
Well, I'll jump in first on this one, if it's all right. My answer is 100% yes. And maybe I'm an optimist, but I'll tell you why. During this tragic time, witnessing what's playing out in Ukraine, there have been some opportunities. And one of the first that I've seen is, which Putin miscalculated on, is our relationship with the transatlantic community, which has coalesced around this. And I see it as an opportunity for galvanizing, this kind of consensus and regenerating what brought us together, the moral narrative, the values, and not just taking it for granted, and actually really looking at together how we go forward. I actually see that more will be motivated to do that. To me, it's very striking. Sweden, Finland, what's happening there in terms of their assessment about NATO. And not only that, but even the flip with regard to Germany. I mean, it happened over a weekend, actually, in this case with Germany, very significant shift. Let me go to a second, your expertise. I'm struck by also the Middle East region. I was in Doha, and the question naturally was, well, how's it going, in your relationship with those that have, drew lines and, there were barricades and, barriers. And actually, I'm optimistic by there too. It coalesces around, if I could say, Iran in a certain way, and even where I was sitting, because people want to see their communities and their societies thrive and do better. And let me just mention a third in the mix is, interestingly enough, I mentioned Asia. I was very struck. I mentioned the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. To me, the issue of the pandemic actually brought forth some creativity. That quadrilateral dialogue came about because of, Malabar exercises, military exercises, and concern out of the rise of China. Having said that, they actually had, I'll use the term Quad Plus, a meeting which brought in South Korea, New Zealand, and Vietnam. Vietnam has a different political system. Why? Because there was a reassessment about supply chains and a concern about not getting critical health products during a pandemic. Shouldn't we, come together? I was very struck by that. And so to me, I'm optimistic. I think that countries are not thinking in, these kind of narrow blinders, but thinking more creatively. And I see that there are opportunities here, which some are moving forward on.
Excellent, Ambassador Ross.
Look, I agree, and I'll take a slightly different point of departure because I want to focus a little bit more on the role we play in terms of helping to ensure that these other kinds of groupings begin to emerge. And I think what Paul was describing is you are seeing a lot of different kind of multilateral groupings emerge because they recognize a set of common needs. I'll just say in passing, apropos of what you said about the Middle East, when people ask me about the Abraham Accords and how they're changing the region, I say, what you didn't understand is the region changed. That's what produced the Abraham Accords. And that's really what you're saying. I just want to say something about us. We have gone through different periods where we retrench. Okay, so after World War I, we pull back. We go into World War II, and after World War II, we realize we actually assumed something we'd never assumed before, responsibilities to others. We were not isolationists historically, we were unilateralists. We didn't have alliances because we didn't want to have obligations to others. So we suddenly assume a set of responsibilities. Okay, we have Vietnam, and we go through the same kind of retrenchment all over again. The change comes partly because of Ronald Reagan, and we have an enemy that's out there, but partly because of Ronald Reagan, and then because of Saddam Hussein, where, Colin Powell says afterwards, we kicked the Vietnam syndrome. Now we go through the forever wars, which discredit our involvement. It produces what I'll call the progressive view of the world, which is the problems internationally are a function of us. If we would just pull back our forward military presence, we wouldn't see all these conflicts. Well, Putin has given us a wake-up call. I think we're going to go through the same kind of process where we have to play the kind of role internationally. And the more we do it, we'll find more of these groupings emerge because our ability to mobilize is unlike anyone else's on the one hand, and also the extent to which we again become seen as being reliable gives others confidence to be able to take steps that they otherwise would not.
And by the way, 30 seconds fast.
I knew it.
Just, I think that you do it, that Dennis said something that I think is important, and that is, an interesting shift here relative to Ukraine and also China, something that you write a great deal about. There's a kind of bipartisanship. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about that, where I have witnessed that, take our Congress, where Republicans and Democrats have really embraced this and have worked together and are looking at the U.S. role in the world in a way that's, I think, positive and forward moving.
That is very optimistic. I'll give you that. We'd love to take your questions. Please just step up to the mic. Whoever gets up to the mic first gets the first question. We'll start there. If you could just tell us your name and your affiliation, if you'd like, if you have one, and if you have any, statements, put them in the form of a question.
Could you also tell us who you are, if that's okay, if you guys could introduce yourselves?
I definitely will, because my handwriting is terrible. No one can read, not even me. So my name is Martin Jirušek. I come from the Czech Republic, where I'm assistant professor at Masaryk University, which is like 400 miles from Ukraine. We currently have over 300,000 refugees in my country, in a country that's 10 million people, which is kind of remarkable. Also historically, for me, this is a unique opportunity. I'm here at George Washington University as a Fulbright visiting researcher, and this is a very timely discussion. I also was following today's funeral of Madeleine Albright, who was born in our nation's capital. And you rewound the clock, so to say, reviewing the assumptions that we were having probably at the outset of this whole thing. I just wanted to point out to one thing that probably became clear as time went by in this past 6 weeks, and that the one that I boiled down to a sentence that I would say that geopolitics is not dead. We thought that geopolitics is gone. When the Iron Curtain fell down, we thought that it will be about liberalism, about market cooperation. And that was the assumption I was hearing when I was visiting my friends in Western Europe, in the United States. And people were telling me geopolitics is dead. I'm personally focused on energy security. I deal with the energy and geopolitics, how energy is used in foreign policy. So things like Nord Stream 2.
You have a question?
Yeah. So my question is, obviously, we see a shift back to geopolitics. We saw that before that. What do you think? What role do you think is there for the United States in this setting? Before that, it looked like the United States is focusing on Southeast Asia more than Europe, is departing from Europe. Now there's been obviously a change with the Russian attack. So my question is, what role is there for the United States in this new setting? Thank you.
Good question. Good question. Either, both. It's up to you.
Go ahead. Go ahead. All right.
Paula
I'll jump in.
first,
Okay, I'll
please.
jump in. Give a concise answer. I would agree with you. In my view, I do think that geopolitics is in place. I think that some of our policies, stated policies, have sided with one region over another, as we've witnessed over time. But here, 100%, we have to be facile. We have to deal with Asia, the growth in Asia. There's competition, that term, great power competition. We are in competition, but I also think that collaboration that's been used also matters. I would stretch what you said to not just Asia and also to Europe. I personally think that our own hemisphere matters. There's a lot that matters here, particularly if we're looking at supply chains and looking at Mexico in terms of manufacturing and moving it away from China. And also Africa, Middle East. And Middle East, you mentioned energy. The Germans, when I was there in Doha, the Germans were very focused on their establishment of an LNG terminal and facility, which they don't have, and how to provide alternative energy strategies. So yes, to your point, I see it as part of great power competition, which I do see is part of an organizing principle of foreign policy. And I have one fast footnote. I can't help myself. The Czech foreign minister was here. I had the great privilege of meeting him recently. And I just want to say, I think the Czech Republic has really played, it's a small country, but it's played a major leadership role. What the contributions that it's making to Ukraine is phenomenal in terms of military equipment, and also something that I will never forget, and I don't know if all of you know this, the Czech Republic has played a phenomenal role in terms of Cuba and Cuba human rights. They have an NGO and NGOs. We would follow you in Cuba policy. So thank you for that.
Thank you. I also met the Czech foreign minister this week and interviewed him, and all he wanted to talk about was China.
That's right. And you
And
even wrote a
Taiwan.
piece.
And I wrote a column.
And he wrote a
about it.
column which said it all.
So yeah, he believes that the U.S. Role is to join with Europe in.
I mean, we are all happy that we are back on the stage because there were times in the past years when our foreign policy was not headed this way.
Sure.
We
Well,
we know that, and we've
yeah.
taken note of that.
yeah. It seems that this government is restoring the tradition of President Václav Havel, and his name came up in Madeline Albriight's funeral a bunch today. Ambassador Ross.
Look, I don't really have much to add to it. The one point I would reinforce that you made is we have to again think globally. We cannot decide, gee, now we're paying attention to Europe again, and we're not giving up our competition with China. China doesn't think only locally. We're going to have to think internationally. The Middle East for sure. Look, we put ourselves in a position where we needed to see the Saudis, who are the one country in the world that actually have significant spare production capacity. We needed them to step up. They didn't. Now, I don't want to get into all the reasons they didn't, but I will say the fact is the way we had been dealing with Saudi Arabia reduced their incentive to respond to us favorably.
Or it could be that they're a totalitarian dictatorship siding with the other totalitarian dictatorship, and that's the other way to look at it. But anyway, we can get to that debate later.
Indeed.
Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you. I'm Max Bowden. I'm with the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. I was going to ask about Europe, but since Saudi was brought up, I was wondering, Ambassador Ross, in I believe it was 2018, you wrote in the Washington Post an article comparing MBS to Ataturk. And since we've been talking so much about assumptions, I'm wondering if you think, in terms of the work that he's done, in terms of the secret, in terms of the religious police and whatnot, do you still agree with that? If not, do you not agree? And if so, what were your assumptions? And the assumptions are not just you, obviously, but many people in this town that believe that MBS could be such a leader. And then I'd actually be interested in hearing why you think that Saudi Arabia will not take calls from President Biden and will not produce its crude production, obviously, because you are in a very unique position to be able to comment on this. So thank you.
Good question.
Yeah, look, what I wrote about was based on what I've seen. I've been going to Saudi Arabia since 1991, and when you go to Saudi Arabia now, it's a different country. I mean, you can't deny that socially Saudi Arabia has opened up. Obviously, there are other behaviors of MBS that we've all seen, but we face a challenge right now. Do we have an approach to Saudi Arabia and the Middle East that takes account of the fact that there are two basic pathways right now in the region? One is basically the Iranians. The Iranians, I like to say, you know what they specialize in exporting? They specialize in exporting missiles, drones, militias, and failed states. Wherever they have a presence, Lebanon, and not presence, where they have leverage, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen. They've paralyzed Iraq now. You can't get a new government formed in Iraq because of them. So they offer that. Now, the Saudis obviously are an authoritarian system, for sure. But it's also a modernizing system. It is one that is opening up socially in ways which is actually not recognizable. I was in Saudi Arabia last summer, and I would say there's a walkway in Riyadh that's called You Walk, literally called You Walk. It's a big promenade, and you walk down it, and everybody's sort of out, and what you see are all sorts of shops and restaurants and cafes. I saw the emblem of what is the emerging Saudi Arabia. It was two women walking arm in arm, one short skirt, nothing, no headscarf, nothing, and another one who is completely covered, and the only thing that you see are slits for the eyes. They were comfortable with each other. That's what's emerging there. So we have to figure out what kind of a relationship we're going to have with Saudi Arabia. It doesn't mean that we have to concede everything, but it does mean that we should try to create certain boundaries in the relationship. We have a stake. We have a stake in them being part of what I described as what the Abraham Accords may be reflecting about the change in the Middle East. We have a stake in building a coalition that confronts what Iran is doing, which is basically to try to be what they are. They are a visionist power determined to try to control the region and oppose anybody who resists what they want. You know, can the Saudis be a part of a broader coalition there? The answer is yes. So I don't think you turn a blind eye to the things that are problematic, but I also think that you don't ignore that you have a strategic set of needs as well.
By the way, your question was directed, and naturally so, but no. On this, I think I'm leaving his answer, but I just wanted to say to you, Max, congratulations that you're working with IFAS. It's a fantastic organization. I used to be on the board, and it does, yes, and I just wanted to say that because I know the work that it does globally and in terms of electoral assistance, and it's phenomenal. So just, it's great.
Sure, I'm happy to give you my personal views. You know, I only met Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman once. He came to the Washington Post on his glamour tour of the U.S. in 2018, 2017, I think. And I know why everyone, believed his story. He was a really good salesman, very charming, very convincing, puts on a great show. But we revised our assumptions when he ordered the brutal murder of my colleague, Jamal Khashoggi, and who was chopped up with a bone saw and inside of the Saudi consulate, and his remains are still, missing. And the cover up and the denial and, the lack of consequences, and that changed a lot of assumptions at the Washington Post. I'll tell you that right now. And including with me personally. And, when we sort of started to turn our attention more to look behind the veil of the sort of veneer of reform and modernization, this is where I respectfully disagree with you, Ambassador Ross, to be quite frank. We found maybe I'll just speak for myself, because obviously I don't speak for the Washington Post or for anyone else in it. I found him to be of a very familiar and recognizable pattern of a brutal murderer who points to economic reform and window dressing of examples of liberalization to distract us from the pile of bodies he's standing in front of. Okay, and to distract us from the women activists who are in prison. How can you have women's reform when all the important activists are in jail? How can you have religious reform when all the moderates, the prominent moderates, are in jail or dead? How can you say that he's a stabilizing force in the region when you look at what he did in Lebanon, and then you look at what he's doing in Yemen? And to me, that seems crazy and very destabilizing, not to mention the export of all sorts of other things to all sorts of other countries. And I think it's a false choice between Iran and Saudi Arabia. I think both regimes are odious, and both regimes represent a vision of the world that's very dark and ugly, no matter what they, tell us when we visit, or no matter what they build, or no matter who they give sovereign wealth funds to, including former sons-in-laws of former presidents. So I think it's ultimately our choice. And again, I sort of take Paula's point from Jean Kirkpatrick that not all these regimes are the same. Doesn't mean we banish them all at once, and some are worse than others. And perhaps Mohammed bin Salman is not the worst. Is Xi Jinping worse? Or is the Ayatollah worse? Is Kim Jong-un worse? We could have a debate about that, but they're all of the same ilk. They are brutal, murderous dictators.
Josh, can I ask you a question?
They will ever be.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
I respect the view.
That's my view.
If Saudi Arabia were to make peace with Israel, would that affect your views?
In other words, can brutal dictatorships do good things? Sure, they can. There are several examples of history. It doesn't change what they are. It doesn't change how we should view them. And if they did make peace with Israel, that would not change my view that the way that MBS is managing his country, his economy, and the political situation inside Saudi Arabia is both immoral and corrupt at its base. And I think the facts bear that out beyond any real argument. Well, I assume that you disagree with that, but yeah, occasionally you can make deals with monsters. But those deals, I don't know. Do they tend to be really reliable? If they're enforced in the right circumstances to avoid a crisis, I'm not against negotiating with monsters. I'm not against.
I'm raising a larger point that if this is if they made
I think it's
peace,
an
I'm not
irrelevant
saying,
point,
look, I'm
you know.
not saying it's going to happen,
Yeah,
but
that's the other thing.
no, but it's obviously it's pretty clear that
Well, look at the Emiratis. There's another dictatorship that's committing horrendous human rights abuses and is totalitarian in its rule and doesn't uphold basic tenets of human rights and exports its oppression and exports Uyghurs back to China to face their deaths. Does all sorts of horrible things. They made a deal with Israel. I'm not against that. They want to make a tourism deal, sure. I'm not going to stand in the way of that because they're, subjecting Uyghurs to torture, which they're doing. So yeah, we got to have some nuance. We got to have some. I'm not arguing against nuance. I'm not arguing against the complexity of the world that we live in. I'm just saying if you're making a list of good guys and bad guys, MBS is a bad guy, MBZ is a bad guy, and yeah, if they can make deals that they are going to stick up to that are in our interests, I'm not saying that in the world that we live in, that those things should be cast aside. I'm just saying we have to be clear-eyed about the people we're dealing with, and when Maya Angelou says, when someone shows you who they are, you believe them the first time. If we had done that with Putin, we might not be in this situation. Anyway, I'm not the panelist. That's not my, I wasn't. I'm supposed to be moderating, but since you asked, that's my basic take on it.
Were you going to make another
Let's
comment?
move on to the next question. We only have time for one more question.
I'm only going to take 30 seconds again this time. I was just
Of
going to
course.
say, by the way, as someone in a governmental role, what you're hearing also to all of you is a challenge that always faces a policy maker is dealing with, I'll use the word realism, of are you dealing with individuals or countries that you don't want to deal with and that are despicable, but it's for something that would be significant in a policy achievement? Or do you also deal with the human rights ledger? And having human rights,
Right.
that. So there's always that
Well,
tension.
I
There
think the
is
human
a
rights-
lot of times.
I think the human rights is actually part of the negotiation.
Oh, it has to be.
When we have used it in the case of
It
the
has to
Soviet
be.
Union or earlier instances of North Korea,
It has to
actually
be.
represents leverage.
Correct. It has to be. And it always is.
Mm.
But the issue is, does it drive how you deal with another country in order to get a quote unquote realistic
Sure.
end?
I'll just say there is never in foreign policy a pure choice.
Right.
So you have to
For
make
sure.
you make judgments.
Sure.
And you balance these judgments. And sometimes you tilt in one direction and other times you tilt in another. You make these choices. And the choices are influenced by what the circumstances are.
But
We got to get to the last question.
But
Yeah.
my belief is you should always be able to do both. Even if you go the realistic way, you should always have the human rights components as part of your dialogue.
Yeah,
That should
and
never be minimized.
And it's admittedly very easy for me as a journalist to always advocate to do the right thing
Right.
because I don't have to actually do it.
Well, as
But
policymakers, I don't know that we were agitated to do the wrong thing.
no, I've reported a few stories for that might contradict that statement. But anyway, for the sake of time,
I can speak for the two of us.
You're right.
We
That's
never
true.
do. Okay.
that's true. I have watched you guys are, I will say, patriotic
And
and
thank-
skilled public servants.
Thank you.
That's
You've
on the record.
You've been
both of
very
them,
generous. Thank
even
you.
though we sometimes disagree. Last question, sir.
Thank you. Good evening. Mohammed Shuman. I'm an attorney in Washington. I'm sorry, first of all, for the loss of your colleague. I
Thank
think
you.
what they did was savage, to be honest. So to my question, I want to ask about the state of the political discourse when we're debating about the merits of US involvement. Why is it seems so poisonous? Like when even someone like Senator Mitt Romney, the most mild and kind politician you can find, describes criticism of potential US involvement by Tulsi Gabbard as treasonous. Why is the State Department telling an AP reporter asking tough questions, oh, well, you can go find solace in Russian propaganda? Why the personal attacks and accusing people of treason and spreading Russian disinformation? Why not just argue amongst each other on the merits? Why has it become so poisonous like this?
Okay, this will be the last. It's a good question
You
to
can begin on
land
that
on.
one.
So I'm going to go last, so I get the last
Okay,
word.
yeah. we'll go
Ambassador
down
Ross.
the line.
Look, this is not a recent phenomenon. I think as our politics have become more polarized, a lot of the reasoned discussion has become harder to find. It used to be that in this town there was a pretty significant center, a pretty significant political center. The political center has shrunk. You're looking at someone. I was a political appointee for 2 Republican presidents and 2 Democratic presidents. I think it's fair to say that I'm an extinct species. So, it would be nice to be able to reestablish that kind of a tradition. I think if that tradition were reestablished, a lot of the political discourse would be less poisonous. Now, having said that, I think you're also looking at, when you look at something like Ukraine, and you see what is just sheer evil, it's hard not to call it sheer evil. When you see civilians are a deliberate target for a reason. I mean, I look at, if you look at how Russia operated in Chechnya, how you look at how they operated in Syria, example in Syria, again, speaking factually, the UN gave the coordinates to the Russians where the hospitals and clinics were. The reason for giving them the coordinates was to ensure that they knew what not to bomb. The New York Times did a very impressive investigation that showed, because they even had intercepts of the pilots talking to each other, that they used the coordinates not to avoid hitting those targets, but deliberately to hit the targets. Now, the reason was to terrorize, to depopulate, to demoralize. There was an express purpose. So when you see that kind of behavior, you call it out. You should call it out, because you're also trying to make it clear that's not acceptable under any circumstances. So there has to be an ability to draw a distinction between identifying that versus those who may adopt a position and argue it. And it shouldn't be, we shouldn't be basically calling names. You should look, if you can't make a case for your argument, then you have to resort to calling names. There's something wrong with your argument.
I had 2 comments, one on your point and then just one concluding comment to go back to the beginning of our discussion. I agree. I was thinking in my mind, what's the way of dealing with it? It has to be called out. I went to the funeral a number of weeks ago of Bob Dole at the National Cathedral. I was a foreign policy coordinator for Bob Dole when he ran for president. And when I was there in the cathedral, what did I hear people reminisce about? Actually, they said this very thing, but not as starkly as you did. They said, we remember the days when senators would come together and they disagree, but there was a code of conduct. And even though they had very different positions, you would never have name calling. You wouldn't have any of these kinds of manifestations that you're referring to, that there was a civility, to use that word. So I think you're right. How does one get beyond that? I think one of the ways is actually calling it out. But it does seem that there's a lower bar and one that has to be changed in that regard. The second thing I'd like to say is just to go back to the beginning, if I may, about Madeleine Albright. I felt compelled to say this because we were talking about Havel. And I wanted to close on this note, and relevant to your question. I had the privilege, she invited me to her home to have a small dinner with Václav Havel. And it was an incredible and a memorable thing for me to do so. And so much so that then I actually went back to Prague years later, and before he died, actually to film him and to ask him on film for the Bush Center archives, what are the messages you want people to know? And one of the things that he certainly said, you'll always have those who have different views from you, but you have to engage in ways that once a decision is made or once, there's an outcome, you have to go forward together. And I loved what he said and what he represented. And I wanted to at least conclude on that note because you raised a very important point and one which, not just our own country, but there was Havel talking about that transition from communism and how to a different society and how it was very tough to transition.
Thank you. Sorry to spoil your positive note ending with
No,
my
please.
comments, which are not going to be positive, but I want to answer your question directly. How did we get here? How did our foreign policy discourse get so broken? Of course, that's a function of how did our overall political discourse in Washington and America get so broken, which it obviously is. And to my mind, just having been in Washington 25 years, is really four things. One, C-SPAN cameras in Congress. Horrible idea. Terrible. The minute that happened, Congress changed forever because all of the bipartisanship that happened on the floor disappeared. It just became a performance, clips for the campaign, speeches, chest thumping, bullshit, attacks, grandstanding. It destroyed the way Congress works. And Congress hobbled along for another 15 years or so after that. But I mean, we used to have things like campaign finance reform and military authorization. It's just really, and that leads me to the second one, which is Citizens United, because I've been a reporter for 18 years, and everything changed once the unlimited gobs of money started going into all of the campaigns. It went from like millions to billions. Okay, no checks, no balances. But what really happened for us on the journalism side is that every story became an attack. Every political story every foreign policy story became an attack because there were millions of dollars behind it. So all of a sudden, the Iran deal, or what did you say about Hamas in 2010 or whatever? There was now $10 million to make sure that was the only story that was going to be in your campaign. So unlimited money in politics corrupted the discourse because it gave the power to people who wanted to ruin the discourse for their own political gains. Number three was Twitter, which I don't really think I have to explain to you. But the movement of the discourse into social media changed the incentives, not just for people, for regular users, but for journalists and for politicians. So the incentive is attention. So the best way to get those attention is to be the most extreme, the most ridiculous. And all the incentives for politics and journalism changed. And now, I mean, there was always you always wanted to get your stuff read, but if your success as a journalist or as a politician depends on your social media success, you're going to say some pretty crazy shit sooner or later. Okay, you're going to go after some people. Okay. Number four was Trump, and I don't say that just as Trump himself, but including Trump himself. Right? He lowered the level of our national discourse. He crashed through the bottom and found a new ugly bottom beneath it. And the way that he conducted, and not him personally to be sure, but a lot of the people who were involved in his campaign and in his administration, not all of them, many of them served with honor, many of them I know personally did the best they could in a tough situation, but a lot of them just took the gutter and just dug a new gutter underneath it. It was really disgusting, and a lot of people's lives were ruined. Professionals, deep staters, like we're all like you all guys want to be, like who were just trying to do their job and represent their country, were turned up in that disgusting wood chipper that was the Trump administration's attack machine. And then the last part is that the foreign interference, which is a real thing, because during the Trump era we saw a huge increase that continues to this day of foreign intelligence agencies, foreign corporations, foreign interests, princes and great leaders and their minions and their lawyers and their lobbyists and their think tankers, who are all bought and paid for, and their consultants and their strategic advisors and their hangers-on and their politicians bought and paid for, corrupting our intellectual integrity for their goals, not for America's goals. Nothing to do with Mitt Romney and Tulsi Gabbard, right? It has to do with someone else's agenda, usually the agenda of the worst actors who have the most incentive to pump millions of dollars into our discourse in order to corrupt it for their own ends. 2017, maybe it was Russia a lot, maybe it's China a lot, maybe it's Iran, maybe it's Saudi Arabia, it's all of them. Look in my Twitter feed, you'll find all four of those countries. They're all there all the time. Someone's paying for that, not Americans. And so that's why we are where we are. But I would love to say that at least inside the Washington Institute on this night, we were able to have respectful, constructive disagreement and discourse about the foreign policy issues of the day. And I would like to thank our two guests, Paula Dobriansky and Ambassador Dennis Ross, for allowing that to happen. Can we give them a round of applause?
I would just,
And
I
any
just say, by the
follow-up
way,
questions?
one little factoid.
Yeah.
The Washington Institute has never taken any foreign money, ever.
Oh, that's great. I didn't mean to accuse the Washington Institute of anything in
Saying-
particular.
I just
love
want
the
to prove your
Washington
point that, validate
Right.
that that this can be done without
Right.
that.
By the way, and forgive me, it's not a follow-on at all to what Josh said, but I felt compelled to say this because of being here at the Washington Institute. It was founded by Martin Indig, I believe, and Rob and then Rob Satloff is the head. But you, Dennis Ross, have been part of this. But something I want to say to all of you. I knew Dennis Ross before I actually met Dennis Ross. And an interesting tidbit, he's very well known for his work on the Middle East, and you're being pivotally involved in negotiations. But you know how I really got to know Dennis Ross? He mentioned his doctoral thesis on Russia. He had a lot of articles on Russia. I knew you as a Russia scholar before he went to the Middle East side. And
I met you, Paula, as a Tibet scholar, to be honest. Paula was the special coordinator for Tibet at the State Department, and that's how I first became aware of you. So
Thank you, but I did
we're all
want to
connected.
say did want to say this because we're on his turf that you mentioned your thesis. No, I've read almost every single one of your articles and materials. I knew him as a Russia scholar, and then
Interesting.
then you became the big Middle East negotiator. So anyhow, just I felt like saying that
good times, good times. All to be discussed
learned
over
a lot.
sushi and beers. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Thank
Josh.
you, Washington Institute. Thank you for the program. Oh, sorry.
Thanks for our wonderful panelists for that great discussion. Feel free to have sushi, beer, network, hang out for a little bit. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was great. Yeah, I didn't read. Yeah, I didn't read any of the questions that I prepared.
Because I know